Okay, the craziest story. McAfee had 2 near-death crazy stories. The first one, he was working on the railroad, and as he had already done. Okay, the McAfee antivirus went later on, but as he was doing other stuff, working at NASA, working on the railroad systems that we know, the very complex software that they still use today, McAfee invented that basically.
Oh, wow.
But he invented it while he was high on drugs. He was basically doing crazy drugs, right? And he was in Brazil or Mexico or somewhere, and I'll never forget this. We're in his truck driving back to his Lexington, Tennessee home, and he told me the story. He said, son, he always called me son. He said, son, I got so high one time, I was permanently fried. And he goes, I had done some orange powder, a big line of orange powder. They only told me to do just a few little granules of it. He goes, but it didn't work. And so I waited 15 minutes. And so I snorted the other part of the line. He says, after he snorted that line, he says, son, I was sitting on my couch in this house in Brazil. He said, and all of a sudden I'm sitting on top of the moon in a rocking chair, just rocking. And I look over the moon into the earth, and I can see myself sitting in this apartment, just sitting there on the couch, just permanent fried. He said for the next year of his life, he was like incoherently, permanently fried. In fact, so bad that he had to move back in with his mom and his wife was there, and he could hear them at one point literally boxing his stuff up, and he could see it happening. And they were talking about admitting him forever into a mental ward. He's permanently fried right now while they're doing this.
Do you know what drug it was?
I have no idea.
You said orange powder.
It was orange powder for anybody out there who knows.
Yeah.
So check this out. He's watching them pack up all of his stuff. They're labeling it, and they're talking as if he can't hear him, because he can hear him, but he can't communicate. He said sometimes he would black out and find himself hitchhiking down the road or just sitting in another person's car and talking to them, or they would be talking to him. He said it was really scary, and he knew he was screwed. He said, so as they're boxing up his stuff, he said a voice came to him, and it said, murder your mom and your wife. Murder them now. And so he said, sounds like a plan. Okay. And so he goes and he somehow finds a shotgun, a 20 gauge pump shotgun. And he said he was walking up to the house with the 20 gauge shotgun. And he said he opened up the screen door, and his mom is there and his wife is there. And he's about to shoot them both dead. He says, and then he heard a voice and it said, hey, sir. And he looked over and he said there was a guy with a little bow tie with a white shirt and a book, a Bible, on a bike, I believe it was. And he goes, yeah. And he goes, can I talk to you about Jesus? And
it's just in my mind, I was thinking, is this somebody from the Book of Mormon or something?
Yeah. He says, can I talk to you about a man named Jesus? And McAfee was really funny. He was always like this. He goes, yeah, sure, why not? Like the voice told him to go murder his family. Sure, why not? So he goes, sure, why not? And so he leans the shotgun against the door of the house, and then he sits in this swing with this guy. And he said, son, for the next 2 hours, this man spoke to me about the most fascinating man that I've ever heard about in my life, this guy called Jesus. And he said, when he was done telling me this fascinating story, the man said, can I pray for you? And he obviously saw that John needed desperate help.
Right.
And John said, sure. And he grabbed John's hand and he said he prayed for John. And he said the moment the guy was done with his prayer, John McAfee literally snapped out of his permanent fry. At this point...
So it sounded like he had a dance with the devil and a dance with Jesus, like literally.
Yeah, and this point, brother, I was literally kind of shocked because I believed in God, right? I wasn't following God, but I knew that Jesus... And I was shocked because I didn't know McAfee believed in Jesus. So I said, after his story, I said, sir, I had no idea you believed in Jesus. He said, I don't. And I said, but you were permanent fried.
Right.
And that guy prayed for you and he spoke about Jesus. He goes, yeah, I know it's weird, but it doesn't mean I believe in Jesus. Wow. I just said he was a fascinating guy. I said, but I was so confused at that.
That is confusing.
Yeah, very confusing.
Yeah. And he didn't really give you a reason. He just said,
no, he said it doesn't
he didn't really see it as a miracle.
It wasn't proof enough for him.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
And it was, I mean, just so I fully understand this, that was just his mind, right? Like there was no real person in a bow tie, right? He was just imagining that.
No, that was a real guy.
Oh, it was a real person.
That was a real dude with a real Bible that came
and
over
saw him with a gun, with a shotgun,
and saw him walking in the house with a shotgun and said,
"That's
hey,
insane.
sir, can I talk to you?"
Kind of sounds like an angel, though. You know what I mean?
That's the story he said, man.
That's wild.
Yeah,
that's wild.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Crazy.
And the fact that he doesn't believe in Jesus now.
No,
it's like, come on.
Yeah, and
then what's the second one?
Okay, the second one, man, thank you for
And by the way, like, it was funny because before this, I just heard Joe Rogan talking about McAfee and saying that they should do a movie on his life. And that being said, I think you should write a book on your experience and that could turn into a movie. So, brother, just throwing that out there right now.
Well, thank you for saying that, man. Thank you for throwing
because you have a perspective that very, very few people had. For 2 years, you were literally right by his side and having these intimate moments that nobody else, like you were in the car, by yourself when he was telling that story?
All the time. Maybe the driver in his guards. I was by his side.
These are fascinating stories.
Dude, this next one's crazy. And so, so in fact, McAfee wouldn't even sleep unless I was like super close to him. The door had to be cracked open. I had to be on the couch in the hotel, and you couldn't even come up to the door. I had to be with him all the time, and you can imagine how draining this was.
I mean, that sounds horrible.
Against the divorce to
anybody, I don't care if you were guarding a saint, like that's still a lot on you. And then just the demanding. It's your life. You're saying that I'm gonna give up my life for another human being. It's basically what you're saying.
It was 24 hours a day, and it was giving up everything. But as we're going along, I go from 500 a day to 700 to 1,000 to making 20,000 every couple of days in these negotiations deals. And so the money lured me in.
Right.
And I can remember that. I just remembered that dark place that I was in right after the SEALs getting out. And I remembered how broken I was. And now I felt like I was up on this mountain, like the palace, the peak. McAfee would just, I remember a Bentley pulling up, a brand new Bentley pulled up, and the guy got out and he said, are you Jimmy Watson? I said, yes, you're here for John McAfee. Yes. He goes, no, I'm here for Jimmy Watson. I said, no, you're not. You're here for John McAfee. And he goes, no, I'm supposed to give these keys to you. And the title, he said, sign right there. And I was nervous and shaking. And I went to John McAfee and said, I'm not signing this. And he says, no, it's yours now, son. And it's yours, son. And he would give me, he said, you like this truck? It was $70,000 aftermarket in this getaway truck with this grill, these sirens. And he said, you love this truck, huh? And I said, sir, this truck is bad to the bones. And he goes, it's yours now. Like stuff like that, throwing me the keys. And so you can imagine how I was all in no matter what.
That keeps you going.
No matter what.
Yep. And so what's the second story?
So the second story, and by the way, I'm doing a book, man. I'm working a deal right now.
Okay, good.
And because there's a message that needs to be put out, and it's not being put out because nobody really knew him, right?
Right.
Nobody was close to him. So the second story, I think equally as crazy, is I leave. The only time I ever left John McAfee was one time in a year period, okay? And I went to take Janice, because he trusted me, and his wife, to the airport. I took her to the airport. I come back, but it only took me 2 hours to go there, drop her off. I come back. I ask where John is, and his guards, he always had bodyguards with assault weapons everywhere. And now they're calling me boss because I'm running the show. And I was like, where's John? Where's Mr. McAfee? And they said, he's in his room. And I was like, what'd y'all do today? Because it was weird. And because he's always up. And they said, well, we went on the boat and we partied. And so I said, okay. And so I went over to the door. I cracked it open. I opened the door and cracked it open. And he's just butt naked. And he's sprawled out like this. And I'm like, whoa. And so I closed the door. So I closed the door. And then I laid down just like I always do on the couch. In the morning, he always would bust through the door and say, get up, give me a cigarette. Smoking his cigarette backwards, drinking scotch. And I would just jump up and we would go all day, right? And he didn't do that. And so I was glad. But I saw the door cracked open now a little bit. I said, that's weird. And so I laid there till about 9 o'clock. And then I got up because something wasn't right. And I walked over to the door and I like cracked it open, and he was in the same position, like sprawled out like this, in the same position. And he was black and blue. All of his body was black and blue. And he was making this noise like this, like a drowning victim. I had seen this in drowning victims and stuff. And so I freaked out in combat. I always kept it cool, cool under pressure. But for some reason, that freaked me out. And I could barely get my thoughts together. I ran over there. I picked his really super heavy body up off. He was sunk down in the bed, gasping. I put him down on the ground. He had urinated himself. It was really hard to understand. Called the ambulance. He was life flighted out. I'm screaming. They life flight him out to the hospital, right? And they put him on like life support, like literally the tubes, the machine breathing for you. His hands are tied down to the bed. And that's worst case scenario for a guy like John McAfee. Worst case. Right. Because he's so paranoid and he's restrained now. But he's out of it. And they're like, Jimmy, we don't know what he did. They thought he induced drugs. They thought I was lying about it. Like, what drugs did he take? And I said, I don't know. And but the drug test came back negative with some he had THC in his body. And so 3 days, I hold his hand. I'm like crying. I'm like by his side because I love the guy, right? And I don't want him to die because it's over. Everything's over. He's over it. He was this incredible storyteller. He's told these stories all the time, and I was thinking, God, even if he comes back, they said he's going to be brain damaged. He's going to have brain damage. He's not going to be able to tell these stories ever again, nothing, And so 3 days goes by, and all of a sudden, brother, he makes a noise, and he starts moving around and starts, his hands, and he wants to yank that tube out. And so he wakes up, long story short, he demands they take it out of his throat with the little, it takes him forever to write this thing, I got a little thing up there and he's doing squeegee. They take all the tubes out against the doctor's advice. All this stuff comes out of his lungs. They're afraid they're going to collapse. He comes back he starts doing card tricks, starts telling his normal jokes. He's perfectly fine. And so, of course, the first thing I do, and when we're alone, I said, sir, did you see anything? Because he was out for that long. Right. I said, did you see anything? And he said, don't ever ask me that again. And I said, Roger that. Well, a couple of days later, he said, come here, I want to tell you something. And I came and sat down next to him. And he said, son, I was hovering across, and he was shook up. His voice is cracking. He said, I was hovering across the ocean, just this glass, like at light speed, just endlessly. He said, and I looked down, and as I looked down, all these terrible faces were coming up out of the water in his hands in the ocean, thousands and thousands of people. And he says, all the dark colors of the world were in that water, the dark blue, black, brown, murky, all this stuff. And his hands are coming up, and they were coming up, and I was being drawn into them, and they were going to pull me in underneath. He says, and suddenly, he says, I looked up, and he goes, all the most beautiful pastels and colors that you could ever imagine were in the sky. The blues, the turquoise, the purple, the yellows up in the sky. He said, and there was this massive white clouds. He says, and as I'm being pulled under, I looked up, he said, and these clouds just kind of parted. He says, and a light came down, a white light, and it said, come up here, it's time. And he said, it scared him. He says, I didn't care about that anymore. He goes, that didn't scare me, the hands and the faces. He goes, whatever that was that called me up because it was my time to be judged. He says, that scared me so bad that I told myself, wake up. And he just started screaming, wake up, wake up. And that scared him so bad that he woke up in the hospital. It wasn't the stuff down there.
Right.
It was his time to go up.
Wow. That's wild.
And so guess what I said? I said, sir, do you believe now? And he said, no.
Wow.
And I just couldn't believe it.
And did you ever figure out what got him in that state?
No, I don't
Because, I mean,
know.
to be black and blue and barely breathing, that's wild.
He said he was poisoned by the Russians or something. He felt like when he put on his sandal or shoe, there was a prick in his toe. And he said that was one way that the Russians would poison people.
Wasn't there something in Running with the Devil about him being poisoned or something? I think. I don't know.
Dude, they didn't cover this in the documentary.
Yeah.
I just can't even believe
Yeah,
it. Like,
I know. I've
these
never heard any of
personal
it.
stories, they don't cover none of this.
Well, they probably don't know. Maybe. I mean,
They don't know, or they've interviewed just so.
because I mean, you said so he had like a team of protectors around him. You were kind of the boss, but other than you and his wife, there weren't too many people he engaged with in his inner circle, right?
No, he didn't engage with nobody.
Yeah.
Zero.
It was only business, but then when he came home, it was just him. And he had to move around a lot too, right? At one point in time, like a lot, right?
Bro, we moved 6 times in 1 year, 6 times. Like, short moves. But one thing about him is he would literally have these antiques in his house. He had this 2,000-year-old Buddha statue that I almost knocked over one day. And because it was in his garage. He got a bunch of his stuff back from Belize and stuff. And so I'm in his garage, and all of a sudden he just says, hey, pack your stuff. Let's go. And I said, where are we going, sir? And he said, just grab your stuff. We're moving. And I said, okay, I'll start coordinating the move of this mansion he's in. He's in this massive house with these artifacts, this all gold stuff, statues. And he goes, no, son, you didn't hear me. Like I said, we're leaving now.